Hello. All right. So today, as it says in the title, we are reading book 2, which is Order. I'm so happy to have this in my hands. And the cover feels so nice too. Silky smooth. All right. So today we are reading chapters 1 through 3. And all right. I'm so excited. A list of episodes. Let's get started. Time keeps moving on. Katerina. Mother Natalia and I walked into the nursery that Frederick had set up 2 months ago. It was only 3 months since we got back from the royal procession, 3 months since Eduardo escaped, and 4 months since I got engaged. As we looked around at the white furniture, yellow walls, and neutral fabrics, I thought about my fiancé. Dmitri was a wonderful guy. He's thoughtful, sweet, courageous, and a lovable gentleman. It didn't hurt that he was a prince, not that it mattered to me, because I fell in love with him as a person on my journey to find the guy who was threatening my family. That man turned out to be Daniel Marquis Jr., the grandfather to my other suitor, Prince Eduardo Marquis. Katerina, said my mother. I blinked. Yes, mother? You were staring into space, dear. She looked at me with concern. I'm fine, mother. I was just thinking about what has happened in the last 8 months. Queen Mother, Natalia said. Please, you're our family. Please call me Lonnie in private when it's just our family. Lonnie laughed happily. I should have said Mother laughed. Lonnie, Natalia agreed. She held up a tiny little dress and a pantsuit. I will be taking both of these into the birthing rooms with me. To surprise my brother after the birth? I asked my sister-in-law. Yes. I want to have him be out of the room during the birth, because I don't think he can handle it. Natalia giggled. Good idea. Make him suffer, I laughed. Katerina, don't tease your brother too much when you see him. Mother ran a hand over my head. Why don't we leave Natalia to finish getting this to her liking, and we go to the chapel to plan for your wedding? I nodded. Good idea, Mother. I turned back to Natalia. Be careful. If you need something, call for help. Natalia was now 8 months pregnant, and she had a cute little waddle as she walked. I will, she said with a smile. Come along, Katerina, my mother said, grabbing my arm and pulling me along. All right, Mother, I'm right here with you, I laughed as I walked alongside her. So, how many guests are you planning? I joked with her. Well, well, there's his family and their guards, Julie and her husband, Lord and Lady Boati, and I invited your cousin, the Countess. She's a shy little thing, but my hope is that she'll come and you'll make friends with her. I looked at my mother with surprise. Really? Yes. I hope she responds to the invitation. Me too, Mother, me too. I walked with my mother as we walked downstairs to the main floor. My mother and I stepped past a door where the menfolk were sitting and talking loudly. I stopped, looking into the room. There he was, Dmitri. He was smiling. I smiled too. Katerina, my mother gently said. Come on. Yes, mother. I was about to turn around to follow her when Dmitri looked up at me. He grinned. I blushed and then noticed that the others were looking up too. I nodded to my brothers and turned to follow mother. Now, are you done drooling over the man? Mother teased me when we were further away. Mother! My eyes widened. She laughed and I sulked. We walked down the hall to the chapel where my wedding would take place in a few months. We planned to have the wedding about 3 months after Natalia's baby was born, so that Natalia could attend it as well. So, what's first? First, we decide what kind of flowers you want. My nose scrunched up as I thought about the flowers for my wedding. For the flowers, I was thinking about pure white lilies. A smile crossed my face as I thought about a gift that Dmitri had given me once. And white and red roses, too. The red roses, white roses, and white lilies would be perfect for both decorating the room and in my bouquet. Why white roses? Mother asked, her brows furrowing. I smiled. Because Dmitri gave them to me on our first date. They mean I'm worthy of you. We both giggled a little. Aw, it's so sweet that he was trying to tell you that he was the one even then. I laughed. He's been really sweet to me. I looked around the chapel. Between each pew, I'd like a soft blue ribbon. Only along the aisle, though. Mother hummed, to bring out your eyes. I smiled. Yes, but also because blue is my favorite color, but the shade won't clash with the flowers. True. Maybe a hint of pale pink in the runner along the aisle to blend in with the decorations, or bright red to go with the red roses. I thought about it for a while as I looked around the room, imagining each color. Either color would work, but maybe for sanity's sake, we should probably go with the red. Mother, said a voice from behind, Adeline is getting fussy. I turned around. It was my younger brother Thomas, holding the 4-month-old princess. My mother walked over to him and took my little sister. Is she hungry? Tired? I think she just wanted me, Mother replied to me. I nodded. Okay, I think I'll see if Dmitri is free. She smiled and replied, We have enough things decided on for now. I smiled and hurriedly walked from the chapel. Thomas followed me to the main hallway before he veered off to the playroom upstairs. I went to the study that the men were in earlier. There they were, still sitting and chatting. I cleared my throat, and suddenly every male in the room turned to look at me. Hello, boys. May I steal Dmitri away? My 2 older brothers and their friends started heckling Dmitri a bit, but Dmitri beamed at me as he stood up and quickly walked over to me. His smile seemed to light up the room as he said, Of course I'm free. What do you want to do? I kissed his cheek. Why don't we go down to the village? We could enjoy the stalls and the bakery. He nodded, his dark brown hair flopping a tiny bit because he hadn't had his hair cut in a while, and said, We can do that. It would be nice to see Julie again, he smiled. We walked through the castle to the front door, where Dmitri opened the door for me. He let me walk out of the castle before him and our hands connected as we walked side by side down the hill to the village. We held hands all the way down. "What's on your mind?" He touched my cheek. "I'm just thinking about how much my life has changed since I met you." "Simply good thoughts." I smiled. He was such a good fiancé. "Remember the first festival on the procession?" "Yes," he replied. "Your younger brothers teased us good over that." "Over what?" I asked, testing him. He leaned over to whisper in my ear, "The kiss." Then he caught my earlobe gently between his teeth, and I gasped in surprise. Laughing, he pulled away. "Tease," I said. "We're not supposed to be doing things like that." "We're engaged, so we can," he replied. "We just can't go to bed together until after we are married." I blushed and walked past him as we continued into the village. I heard his chuckle from behind me, but I ignored it as I greeted each villager I came across. We got to the bakery and I pushed open the door. "Julie," I called, not seeing her. The woman walked in from the back. "It's good to see you." "It's good to see you too." I smiled at the baker's wife. She was a little portlier than she used to be, but she was still as strong as any man. Her husband was nowhere in sight. But before I could ask about him, Julie spoke again. "I was saddened to hear that you still haven't found that traitorous Prince Uranus." She shook her head. "It's been 3 months. Surely there would have been word by now. One would think." I was still upset that Eduardo had killed the ones guarding him and taken off. I shook my head to let the bad thoughts go and asked, "Where's your husband?" Julie looked saddened. "He's upstairs. He's not feeling too well lately, Your Highness." "I'm sorry to hear that, Julie. Is there anything I can do?" I couldn't believe that she was going through something like this. Dmitri held out a handkerchief when it looked like Julie was going to cry. Julie grabbed the handkerchief gently. "Thank you, Prince Dmitri." "No, Princess, there's nothing you can do. He's been sick for a while, and it seems to have caught up to him." Julie sniffed, and then the tears started falling. She didn't know how she could survive without her husband. Her children had grown up and left for the wild unknown. I ran around the counter and wrapped my arms around the baker's wife. "Oh, Julie, you should have told my father or my brother. They could have gotten the Pope here to pray over him." "Your brother had just become king when my husband got sick. It wasn't fair to ask him then. And then you all went off on the procession." Julie smiled through her tears. She wiped her eyes and hugged me back. "Why didn't you say anything when we got back?" I asked. "I was confused about how someone could just hide an illness from the king." Julie sighed. "I guess we were too embarrassed at that point and didn't want to bother the king." "I see," I replied. I stepped back to look at her. An idea started to form in my head, but I wanted to discuss it with my family later before I brought it up with Julie. "Come on, Katerina," Dmitri said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Let's leave her to her work. Let's go to the fountain in the village center." "Okay," I agreed, and we said our goodbyes to Julie. As we left, I turned to look back at her and saw her tearily look up the stairs to the second floor. "Her husband is not going to make it," I said with solemn clarity. Dmitri looked at me in shock. "What?" Bachelor party, Dimitri. I looked at her in shock. What? Katerina smiled sadly at me after turning around. It's just a feeling I have. He's not going to last much longer. They really should have come to my brother when we got back. How did she know these things? Was she blessed? Or did she just have really good intuition? I had to ask. How do you know he'll die soon? Katerina looked at me sadly. Intuition mixed with common sense. If you're ill and don't do anything to fix it, then it could get worse and you die. She shook her head. I don't want to think of it anymore. Let's go do something else. Okay, I agreed. Okay, I agreed that thinking about someone's death was sad. I led her away from the bakery and around the village. We spoke to people as we walked, and we stepped out of the village to head towards the pond where we started our journey. Can you believe that it's been 9 months since we started on our journey? To find out who was threatening your family? Technically 8, but 9 if you count the months of them getting to know each other. Okay, anyway. No, she said. She looked around at the pond and the surrounding area, unknowingly giving me time to pull a small bundle out of my shirt. I had this sent out from home. My mother thought that you would like it, and I thought that it was finally time for me to give this to you. I unfolded the small package and waited for her to turn around. As she turned around, I held out the cloth bundle. On the cloth was a beautiful ring and a simple design, made of platinum with a medium-sized sapphire in the center. It showed a timeless beauty. This was my great-grandmother's engagement ring. I would have had this ready for you before we got back from the procession, but they had to find it and clean it first. It's beautiful, she exclaimed. Then she excitedly held out her left hand and I slid the ring onto her ring finger. I'll always treasure it. I smiled happily. I know that our marriage was arranged before we were born, but I hope to make this a real marriage. I do too, she replied. Katerina's eyes lit up as she beamed at me. Then she leaned forward and gently pressed her lips to my own. My hand reached up to hold the back of her head as my lips slanted over hers. Our lips moved together as we tried to pour our love into the kiss. Our eyes were closed, and we moved closer to each other. Her arms slid around my neck, and my free arms slid around her waist. A sudden voice broke us apart. What do you think you are doing? We jumped apart. I whirled around and saw that it was just George, Katerina's second oldest brother. I sighed, relaxing. George scowled. You might be engaged and can now kiss and cuddle, but you are not allowed to maul each other's mouths like this. It's unseemly. He glared at me. Katerina, come. He turned around, expecting her to follow him. Katerina and I looked at each other, and Katerina giggled before she followed her brother. She acted contrite as she walked next to her brother, but I knew she was still giddy from our kiss. I turned back to the pond and sat down. I reflected on what had happened since I met Katerina and what I dreamed our future would become. I smiled as I thought of the life I would someday soon have with the girl of my dreams. We would live in my castle for part of the year and in her family's castle for the other part of the year. That would continue for the entire time that we were prince and princess. Or at least, that's my hope. I was excited to start our married life soon, but the fortune from the fortune teller still lingered in the back of my mind. A few months ago, around the beginning of the royal procession, Katerina and I had gone to see a fortune teller to see how our future together was going to go. The woman had told us that Katerina had an enemy that we should be wary of, and that the enemy would do something soon. Then, when we got back from the procession, we found out that Eduardo had escaped the dungeons and fled the country. I was furious that Eduardo had escaped and was somewhere plotting to hurt Katerina. He better not do anything, or else I'd make his life difficult. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. After sitting there for a while, I got up to head back to Katerina's castle. It was time to face the music for passionately kissing my fiancé. I chuckled at the thought. They were just being protective of her. I slowly made my way back to the castle, getting sly grins from the men of the village. Obviously, they had seen George march Katerina back to the castle, and he had been telling her off for it. It was a bit unusual to hear George talk so much, but after having grown out of his stutter for the most part, he was starting to loosen up a bit and talk more. As soon as I walked into the castle, I was assaulted by a commanding voice. It was Lonnie, the Queen Mother. Dmitri Romanova. I turned slowly to look at her. Yes, Queen Mother? Come here. Her voice had no room for argument, so I walked over to where she was standing in the doorway of her new sitting room. We shall talk inside, she said as she turned to walk into the room. She sat on a settee and looked at me harshly. Frankly, I'm disappointed in you. She frowned. What were you thinking? Yes, you are engaged, but you are royal. You do not have the luxury of making out with your fiancé. You have to show decorum. Decorum, rather. That is the only way people will respect the royal family. I looked down at the ground and said, I am sorry. I did not mean to disrespect you or Katerina, and I will try to do better. What can I do to make this right? Lonnie sighed. I'm afraid there's nothing you can do now except to make sure that you do not do this again. Thankfully, the villagers seemed more amused than outraged and shocked. I looked back up at her, trying not to smile, but she saw it anyway if the look of exasperation was any indication. I burst out laughing. Sorry, Lonnie. I don't mean to laugh. It's just that I was getting grins from the village men as I walked back to the castle. She sighed again and shook her head. What am I going to do with you two? Love us anyway? I asked with a small laugh in my voice. Shoo, she said, waving her hand at me. I'm sure she smiled as I left the room. I hurried away from the sitting room and went to find out where Katerina was before someone else stopped me. But, alas, that was not meant to be. Dmitri, said a now 14-year-old Thomas. He sounded disappointed, but as I turned to look at him, his eyes showed amusement. So, you were making out with my sister, huh? Yes, I answered plainly. Thomas laughed. Man, I was trying to be all serious. He continued laughing anyway. Why did you do it? Do you want people to question her virtue before the wedding? Mm, pardon me. No, I exclaimed. I would never want anyone to question that. I frowned at the thought. I had just given her the ring that I had my mother send over, and we were celebrating. Thomas shook his head. Okay, just don't go overboard again. Then he walked away. I have this mark on my arm now, from where it was landing on the edge of the desk. Mm. I walked. I waited to see if anyone else would stop me, and sure enough, the king himself halted me with a sharp command. I turned again and saw Frederick sitting at his desk. Taking a deep breath, I walked over to the king's study. Sit, the king demanded. When he complied, when I complied, he looked up from his paperwork and sighed. I'm sure the others told you the same, but what you did was inexcusable. I looked down into my lap as I muttered, Sorry. I didn't mean to disappoint Katerina's oldest brother and king. A snicker made me look up, and Frederick said, You're not in trouble. You know that I have to protect my sister's honor, right? He laughed a bit and shook his head. I have to admit that the way you sat there looking at your lap in shame was kind of satisfying, though. He chuckled at the look of shock on my face. You weren't mad? I asked. No. Disappointed, but not mad. Frederick chuckled. Besides, we have to get you ready for your bachelor party. We'll be staying in the guest house tonight for it. Oh. I had forgotten that my bachelor party was tonight. I forgot. You forgot that you're having your bachelor party a few months early because our family is growing and you wanted to not take away from that excitement? I blushed slightly. Yes. He laughed. Go on, get out of here. Enjoy the rest of today. After dinner, we are heading to the guest house. Thank you, I said, bowing and leaving the room. I had a girl to find and express my embarrassment at being told off by her family. We enjoyed a rather delicious dinner, talking and laughing about everything. I looked over to see Katerina holding her little sister, and my breath hitched. She looked so natural holding a baby. It was like she was born to hold children, and I couldn't wait until we had one of our own. I smiled at the thought and continued to eat. After dinner, George pulled me from my chair and said, Come on, it's time. He started to push me out of the room. Time for what? Katerina asked, curious. Frederick laughed. We're having his bachelor party tonight. It was his idea to have it a few months early because of the new baby coming, and he didn't want to take away from the excitement. That's so sweet, Natalia awed. She was so touched that I wanted to respect her and the baby she was carrying. Frederick smiled at his wife and then looked at Katerina. Don't worry, you'll have him back in one piece. He waved and then followed after his brother and I, after his brother and future brother-in-law. Well, it was going to be a wild night. I was pushed all the way to the guest house and inside. Hey, you don't have to keep pushing me, I cried out. The two brothers laughed at me as the noise in the guest house got louder all of a sudden. There were a lot of guys in the house, and drinks, and even a few dancers from the neighboring villages. We drank and had a lot of fun. I would not remember much from this party, I was sure. I hoped that I didn't puke. Life has a way of surprising you. Frederick. I groaned as I woke up. My head hurt so much. Apparently, I had a lot to drink last night. But I wasn't the only one, if the answering moans were any indication. I looked around and nearly laughed out loud. Sometime during the night, Dmitri had cuddled up between me and George and had wrapped his arms and legs around George's body. George had, in return, wrapped an arm around Dmitri to hold him in place. It was an amusing sight. I stood up and turned in a circle as I watched the others start to wake up. I leaned over to wake up Dmitri and George. Apparently, Dmitri didn't want to get into trouble with Katerina, so he had done everything in his power to stay away from the dancers, even when drunk. I shook first Dmitri and then George. They slowly woke up and sat up. Dmitri blushed slightly, but neither George nor I said anything to embarrass him. Come on, I said, straightening up. We need to sober up and get back to the castle. Not necessarily in that order. The other people in the guest house got up slowly. They were really hungover, and the dancers had to pick up their accessories from everywhere when the party had gotten really wild. A few people came out of the bedrooms with wrinkled clothes and lipstick smears. I shook my head, thankful that Dmitri, George, and I hadn't gotten in that kind of trouble. Okay, everyone, I called quietly. Thank you for making my future brother-in-law's party great. I hope you make it home safely. The guests waved and left, having gathered their things. They were glad that they didn't have to clean up after the party. Dmitri and George walked to the front door of the guest house. Their bodies moved in the slow way that many with hangovers experienced. Their world must be spinning worse than mine, because they braced themselves against the open door frame as they waited for me. Okay, I'm coming, I said, walking towards them. I would have the maids come clean this up later. I was just not up to doing anything just yet. The three of us walked slowly to the castle and stepped inside to see two upset women. What? I asked. Don't what me? Katerina exclaimed sharply, making our heads hurt. This came this morning while you were sleeping, and it shocked your wife enough to go into labor. She thrust the envelope in her hand into mine, not caring that she had just short-circuited my brain. Natalia was in labor? Dmitri pushed me forward towards the birthing rooms. I looked at him before rushing deeper into the castle, the envelope in my hand forgotten for now. My footsteps pounded along the halls as I ran to the birthing rooms. Absent-mindedly, I heard people hurrying behind me, but I paid them no mind. The first person I saw when I entered the first birthing room that I came to was Natalia. Her forehead was dotted with sweat as she lay there panting. I started forward, but she saw me and yelled at the midwife to get me out of there. I was confused as I was pushed out of the room. Katerina and Lonnie barely glanced at me as they hurried into the room that I had been banished from. They shut the door behind them as Dmitri and George walked over to me. Why are they allowed in, but I am not? I asked in a daze. Maybe Natalia didn't think you'd be able to handle it, George replied, sitting down outside of the room. Dmitri followed his example by sitting down too. I paced until Dmitri told me to read whatever was in the envelope. I pulled the sheet of paper from the envelope, and the two words on it chilled me to the bone. Be ready. My head jerked up and I called for a guard. When no When one arrived, I told him, I want every available guard to search for whoever left this note, except for your most trusted guard. I want that. Ow. Mm, I bit my tongue. I want that guard to come here and guard my wife and child. Yes, sire, said the man. He left to go spread the word, and even sent a younger and healthier man to guard the queen and babe. He would have done it, I knew, but he wasn't as strong as he used to be. He was getting older, and I just knew that he wanted to be out there finding the perpetrator instead of getting the queen and baby killed. I had the young guard stationed with us outside the birthing room as I heard the screams and yells of pain through the door. If it wasn't for Dimitri and George holding me back, I would have broken down the door to get inside. Suddenly, I heard something that made my legs weak. A baby's cry. My legs collapsed and I hit the ground. My baby was born. I stared at the closed door until laughter reached my ears. It was Dimitri. Why are you laughing, boy? Dimitri tried to control his laugh and was finally able to reply. I'm sorry. It's just hilarious that you fall over when you hear your baby. I glanced over and saw George trying to hide a grin. Just you wait until you have a child of your own. I scowled as I scrambled to my feet. The tips of my ears were red, showing just a hint of my embarrassment. I knocked on the door, waiting until they said that I could enter. Taking a deep breath, I waited anxiously. Lonnie opened the door a little while later and smiled at my expression. You may come in now. Natalia and the baby are all cleaned up and waiting for you. Don't worry, they are both perfectly healthy. Just be quiet as you walk in. You don't want to startle your child. I hurried into the room, excited to see my wife and child. There they were. Natalia was lying in bed, holding a bundle in white. Hi, I say, staring at my beautiful wife. She glowed with a beauty that all new mothers had. I walked over to her bedside. Hi, she replied with a smile. Would you like to see your child? When I nodded, she handed me the bundle. I looked down into the sleeping face of my child and saw hints of myself in them. I glanced around the room to see anything that might hint at whether I had a son or daughter, because I didn't want to uncover the baby and make them cold. I saw a little white pants set on the dresser, and my heart pounded in my chest. I had a little girl. I smiled at Natalia and said with tears of joy in my eyes, I have a daughter. Natalia laughed softly. Yes, you do. We do. She smiled at the picture of me holding our girl, and I couldn't help grinning in return. I was a proud papa, looking down at my baby girl and gently rocking her. I didn't even notice that my mother and sister left the room, taking the midwife with them to give us some quiet time. No tears fell, but my throat felt like closing as I memorized every detail about my baby's face. She had Natalia's almond-shaped eyes and little button nose, but she had my slightly thin lips that I hoped she would grow out of. She had small round ears and a head of dark curly hair. What's her name? I thought we could name her together. Natalia reached out to take her from me, and I handed the unnamed princess over. What about Clarice? She asked me. That's a good name. But how about Elizabeth? It's a nice, strong, royal name. I looked at Natalia to gauge her reaction. Elizabeth Clarice Peterson. I love it. Natalia looked at me with a smile. I chuckled. Both are extraordinarily strong names. She will grow into a very independent princess. Natalia's eyes glinted with mischievousness, like her Aunt Katerina. Oh, I said, laughing, don't remind me. She joined me in laughter until a knock had us looking at the door. Come in, I called out. It was my mother, Lonnie. May we come in? I looked at Natalia, who nodded, before I replied, of course. Mother opened the door wider and stepped inside, letting the others in as well. Katerina, Dmitri, and George stepped inside. Dmitri and George laid their eyes on my daughter for the first time as they each came over to give Natalia a kiss to the forehead. She's beautiful, Dmitri said, complimenting my daughter as George nodded in agreement. Thank you, Natalia and I responded together, glancing at each other in amusement. Katerina asked us, Did you decide on a name yet? We did, I replied. Elizabeth Clarice Peterson, Natalia finished. Mother smiled at us. What a wonderfully strong name. If you don't mind, I'd like to bring the kids in to see their niece. Natalia replied, I don't mind. But Natalia and Elizabeth knew the rest too, so it can't be for a long time, I added. Mother nodded in understanding and left to get my other siblings. When she came back, she had the now 14-year-old Thomas, the 12-year-old Derek, Blake, who was almost 7 years old, and Adeline, who was 4 months old. Sorry, my sister came in to tell me about Dad, and my cat snuck in. Okay, Blake, who was almost 7 years old, and Adeline, who was 4 months old. Now, we can't stay long, so keep that in mind. Mother nudged the children forward as she spoke. Thomas and Derek came over calmly and looked over at Elizabeth. She's pretty cute, Thomas observed. Derek agreed. Yes, she is. I wonder what Rose would have looked like as a baby. Mother looked a little choked up, but she replied. She had your light brown hair and pale eyelashes. Her nose tipped up a little and her lips were full. Derek looked back at Mother with a small smile. Thanks, Mother. He turned back to Elizabeth. She'll be a real beauty when she grows up, he said sagely. I watched as he and Thomas moved out of the way so that Blake could climb onto the bed to see Elizabeth. Blake still had some baby fat in his cheeks, but he was too adorable to tease too much. I mentally shook my head. It wasn't something a guy thought, to be honest. Maybe it was because I was a new dad and giddy on the birth of my daughter, but I just couldn't help thinking that my youngest 2 siblings were adorable. Blake looked down onto Elizabeth to see her eyes slowly open. His own eyes got huge as he turned to look at Mother. Her eyes opened, he said excitedly. He turned back to Elizabeth. to gently pet her head. "I'll look after you, Lisbeth," he said. He was missing a front tooth, so he couldn't help but mispronounce her name. But it was cute nonetheless that he wanted to be her protector. "Elizabeth," I corrected. "And what about Adeline? Will you look after her too?" He nodded frantically. "Of course, I'm a big boy now." "Yes, you are," Katerina replied, coming over to the bed. "Come on, Blake. Let's let Adeline meet Elizabeth." "Okay," Blake said, reaching out for Katerina to pick him up. As I watched Katerina walk over to Dimitri with Blake on her hip, I thought about everything she had gone through while trying to find out who was threatening us during the past year. She had left the relative safety of the castle to travel the world, searching for the person who turned out to be Eduardo's grandfather. I still couldn't believe that Eduardo had come here to woo my sister because of a contract that his great-grandfather had set up, while knowing that his grandfather wanted what his grandfather wanted to do. Even he even helped his grandfather threaten us and set it up to where Katerina didn't know who to trust on her journey. I thought about how much Katerina had changed on the journey, and even as we were on the royal procession shortly after my ascension to the throne, she had grown into a fine young woman. I couldn't believe how much she's changed from the spoiled, selfish, jealous person she was. Sure, she was still spoiled, but she wasn't as selfish now that she had fallen in love with Dimitri. Dimitri was the other prince that came to woo my sister a little over 8 months ago. To be honest, I liked him better from the beginning, but my wife and mother liked Eduardo. "Life has a way of surprising you sometimes," I mutter. And that's the end of chapter 3. I ended a little early, but that's okay. I am excited to read more. And just so you see him. There he is. He's a spoiled little baby, that's what he is. He likes my bed. But next episode is a big surprise. And that's when the ball gets rolling for the story. So I'm excited to share that with you. If you want to follow along with me, I have the link right here. And I'm going to put it in the comments below. It's also in the description. So you will have it in 2 or 3 places. So, Order is book 2 out of 7. And, oh boy, I am currently writing book 4 right now. So happy. So yeah, I think we have 13 episodes of Order, and then I will have to start reading Youth through my phone because I can't get the book to me in person right now because I have to finish setting that up. I left it for a while. I need to set up the paperback version of Youth, and then it might take me a while after that to get the book in my possession. But reading it from my phone is fine. No big deal. All right, I'm so happy. I shall see you Wednesday for episode 2, and I don't know. We'll just go from there. All right? I hope you have a wonderful day, and I shall see you next time. Bye bye.